The sky above King's Landing did not break so much as exhale. No thunder preceded it. No lightning split the clouds above the Red Keep's towers. There was simply a moment, one breath between heartbeats, where the air above the street of steel shimmered like heat, rising from Valyrian forges. Then came the light, a column of pale gold, silent and total, lasting no longer than it took a sparrow to cross a courtyard. And when it faded, a man lay in the dust of the street below, robes the color of river sand pulled around him, a strange cylindrical object attached to his belt. The small folk gathered before the gold cloaks could push through. They always did. Qui-Gon Jinn opened his eyes slowly. The way a man wakes from a dream he already knows will haunt him. The Force was everywhere. That was the first thing he registered. Not the smell of horse dung and salt fish. Not the unfamiliar weight of the air. Not the medieval sprawl of stone and smoke rising around him. It was the Force, but not as he knew it. In the galaxy he came from, the living Force hummed like a river current. Present, directional, warm with intention. Here it bled. It seeped from the cobblestones and the roots of trees 300 feet below the city's foundations. It poured from the faces of frightened small folk staring down at him with wide, superstitious eyes. It roared from somewhere impossibly far to the north, a sound not of ears but of bones, cold and enormous and ancient beyond any Sith he had ever faced. He sat up carefully, cataloging himself. No injuries. His lightsaber was intact at his belt. His connection to the Force was unbroken, stronger here in some ways, stranger in others. He could feel every heartbeat. In the crowd around him, fear, awe, the particular mix that preceded either worship or violence. Gently, the Force seemed to say, "Watch. Don't move." A gold cloak pressed through the circle, spear leveled. Then 3 more. The man in command, broad-shouldered, red-faced, the kind of authority, purchased through intimidation, stepped forward with his hand on his sword hilt. "On your feet. Hands where I can see them. Who are you and how did you come to fall from the bloody sky?" Qui-Gon rose without hurry. He was tall enough that the act of simply standing caused the front row of small folk to step back. He did not reach for his lightsaber. He kept his hands open, his expression the same calm that had disarmed Senate chambers and Sith lords alike. "My name is Qui-Gon Jinn," he said. His voice carried, not loudly, but with the quality of certainty that fills a room. "I am a traveler. I mean no harm to anyone here." The commander laughed, but it was the laugh of a man buying time. A traveler who fell from the sky. He looked at his men. "Take him." What followed was brief and almost gentle. When the first gold cloak reached for his arm, Qui-Gon redirected the grip with 2 fingers and turned the man's momentum into an arc that sat him softly against the wall. The second received a flat-palmed push from 3 feet away, a Force-assisted nudge that sent him stumbling back into his fellows. The third raised his spear and found it spinning slowly in the air above his head, suspended without explanation, rotating like a compass needle finding north. The crowd went absolutely silent. Qui-Gon lowered the spear to the ground with a thought. "I would prefer," he said quietly, "to speak with whoever leads this city. I suspect they would prefer that too." He was wrong about one thing. The small council didn't want to speak with him. They wanted to dissect him, politically, strategically, and in the case of Grand Maester Pycelle, perhaps literally. Within 2 hours, he was seated in the Tower of the Hand, clean water and cold meat placed before him with the kind of hospitality that is indistinguishable from a cage. Lord Tywin Lannister sat across from him, and Qui-Gon had spent enough time reading senators and Sith to know immediately that this was the most dangerous man in the room. Not because of the sword at his hip, because of his eyes, calculating, patient, utterly without mercy, and because he was the only person present who wasn't afraid. "You threw 4 gold cloaks across a street without touching them," Tywin said. "It was not a question. I touched 2 of them," Qui-Gon replied. "The others I moved at a distance." "How?" "I am sensitive to a natural energy that exists in all living things. I have been trained since childhood to perceive and interact with it." He paused. "I understand this will be difficult to accept. I assure you it is not sorcery in any dark sense." Tywin was quiet for a moment. A man who can move objects without touching them and cannot be detained by conventional means is either an extraordinarily dangerous enemy or an extraordinarily valuable asset. He leaned forward slightly. I am offering you the chance to be the latter. Qui-Gon looked at the Lord of Casterly Rock for a long moment. Beneath the steel patience, he could feel it through the Force, ambition old enough to have its own gravity. Love buried so deep beneath pragmatism it had nearly fossilized. And grief, tremendous and calcified, that the man had transformed into architecture. He had met men like this before. He had never been foolish enough to trust them. You're very kind, Qui-Gon said pleasantly. But I've found that offers made before a man knows what he wants tend to carry hidden costs. I'll decline for now. Tywin's expression did not change, but his eyes did. Careful, the Force whispered. If you want to see more characters cross into impossible worlds, hit that subscribe button and drop a name in the comments below. Cersei Lannister came to him at night. This was, Qui-Gon had learned in his first 3 days within the Red Keep, how she preferred to operate, not in the torchlit formality of the throne room where Joffrey preened and postured with a boy king's cruelty, not in the small council chamber where her father's presence compressed every other voice in the room to a whisper. Cersei moved in the hours between the last bell and the first gray light of dawn, in corridors where candle flame made shadows conspire, where a word said softly could not be attributed and a promise made could be unmade by morning. She was more dangerous than her father, Qui-Gon had decided, not more powerful. Tywin was a siege engine, patient and total. But Cersei was fire contained in a vessel slightly too small. And fire in that condition does not burn in straight lines. She brought no guards. That alone told him how seriously she wanted something. You've been given comfortable rooms, she said, settling into the chair across from where he sat cross-legged on the floor. His eyes already opened before she entered. He had felt her coming. Her emotional signature through the Force was unmistakable. A thermal bloom of pride and desperation. And something buried beneath. Both that might once have been tenderness. I trust the Hand's household has seen to your needs. The food is extraordinary, Qui-Gon said genuinely. I haven't eaten bread like this in decades. Perhaps ever. She studied him with the particular attention of a woman who had spent her life being underestimated and learned to return it precisely. You refused my father's offer. I did. He hasn't forgotten. I didn't expect him to. Cersei's fingers traced the armrest slowly. The things you did in the Street of Steel. I've had 3 septons, a Wood's Witch, and Grand Maester Pycelle offer me explanations. None of them satisfy. She met his eyes directly. She was not a woman who approached things sideways when directness served better. What are you? Qui-Gon considered her for a moment. Through the Force he could feel the genuine quality of the question beneath the political calculation. She actually wanted to know. That, he decided, deserved an honest answer. In the world I come from, there are people called Jedi. We are trained from childhood to perceive and work with a living energy that flows through all things. We study it, serve it, and try to act as its instruments in the resolution of conflict. He paused. We are peacekeepers, not sorcerers, not gods. Peacekeepers. Peacekeepers, she repeated, and something in her tone shifted, not mockery exactly, but the sound of a word being held up to light and found insufficient. And in your world, does that work? It was a better question than she knew. Qui-Gon was quiet for a moment, thinking of the Jedi Council's blindness, of Anakin Skywalker's hands, of a future he had seen fraying at the edges like old cloth. Not as well as it should, he admitted. Something crossed Cersei's face, respect, perhaps, for the honesty. It disappeared quickly. I want you to train Joffrey. The Force didn't need to tell him. He had seen Joffrey in the throne room, watched the Boy King sentence a man to lose his tongue for singing an unflattering song, observed the particular quality of cruelty in his eyes, the kind that enjoyed the act, not merely the result. A Sith in training had more self-discipline. No, Qui-Gon said. Cersei's composure cracked at the edges, just slightly. She had not expected that. No one said no to the Queen Regent without architecture around it, conditions, alternatives, diplomatic cushioning. He had simply said no. You understand what I can offer you, she said carefully. Protection, resources, a place in this court. I understand exactly what you're offering, Qui-Gon replied. He kept his voice kind, because she had not yet threatened him, and he did not repay courtesy with coldness. And I understand why. You love your son. That love is real, and it is immense. And it is perhaps the most honest thing about you. He watched her face go very still. But I will not train cruelty to be more effective. Whatever gift I carry, I will not put it in service of that. The stillness lasted 3 seconds. Then Cersei rose. Her composure rebuilt stone by stone in the space of a breath. You've made an enemy tonight, she said quietly. I already had one, Qui-Gon replied. Your father was faster. She left without another word. He listened to her footsteps recede down the corridor and then sat with the silence she left behind. Through the Force, the Red Keep breathed around him. Ambition and fear. And old violence soaked so deep into the stones that it had become a kind of weather. He had felt darkness before. Sith temples, the caves of Dathomir, the slave quarters of Tatooine. But this was different. This darkness was entirely human in origin, which somehow made it heavier. He thought of Tywin's eyes, of Cersei's compressed fury, of Joffrey's laugh in the throne room when the man's tongue was taken. And from the north, always, from the north, the Force pulled at him like a tide, cold, insistent, growing louder by the day, a frequency below hearing that vibrated in the marrow. Something was wrong up there, in a way that made political intrigue feel like children arguing over toys. He needed to move. Whatever the Force had brought him here to find, it was not in the Red Keep's corridors of power and perfectly poisoned hospitality. He began planning his departure before dawn touched the towers. Getting out of King's Landing, he discovered, was its own kind of negotiation. The city's gates tracked everyone. The gold cloaks had standing orders, Tywin's, he suspected, rather than Joffrey's, to report his movements without restricting them. A leash long enough to feel like freedom. He left anyway, walking through the gate at first, light with nothing but his robes and his lightsaber, a pouch of coins pressed on him by a serving woman who had watched him quietly heal her daughter's infected hand wound with a sustained application of Force-guided cellular stimulation. She had called it a miracle. He had called it concentration. They had agreed to disagree. The King's Road stretched north. The Force pulled with it, steady and urgent as a compass finding true. Behind him, the Red Keep watched him go. He could feel the weight of Lannister attention on his back like a second cloak, calculating the distance, measuring the angle, deciding whether a man who walked away from power was more dangerous than one who accepted it. Don't look back, the Force suggested. He didn't. The North swallowed him gradually. It was not like the cold of deep space, which was absolute and indifferent. The cold of a universe that simply had no opinion about whether you lived or died. This cold had character. It pressed against him with something that felt almost like intention, lowering itself by degrees as the King's Road gave way to unpaved tracks, as oak and elm surrendered to pine and ancient spruce whose branches held snow. Like cupped hands, the small folk in the villages he passed grew quieter, more deliberate, with the particular economy of people for whom winter was not a season but a theology. He felt at home in a way that surprised him. These were people who understood that survival required more than cleverness. He had traveled for 11 days when he reached Winterfell. The Stark household received him with a directness that was almost jarring after King's Landing, Robb Stark, meeting him in the yard himself rather than sending a steward. No performance of power in the gesture. Just a young man with his father's sense of duty written plainly across his face, trying to assess whether the stranger at his gate was a threat or a resource or something the North had simply never catalogued before. You're the man who fell from the sky above King's Landing, Robb said. Not accusatory, confirmatory. Word travels fast, Qui-Gon replied. Ravens travel fast. Men talk. Robb studied him with gray stark eyes. My father would have wanted to hear your story before deciding anything about you. I'll try to do the same. He stepped back and gestured toward the great hall. Come inside. You look like a man who's been listening to something that won't let him sleep. Qui-Gon paused. That is extraordinarily perceptive. My father always said the North teaches you to read weather. People aren't so different. Something moved behind the young lord's eyes. Grief. Fresh and not yet hardened into the shape it would eventually take. He taught me that. Eddard Stark, Qui-Gon remembered, piecing together what he had quietly learned in his days at court. Executed. A man of honor destroyed by a system that treated honor as a weakness to be exploited. He had felt the ripple of that death in the Force even then. Not the man specifically, but the consequence of it. The way a stone thrown in still water reorganizes everything it touches. Inside, over a fire that smelled of pine resin and tallow, Qui-Gon told Rob an honest version of his story. He left out nothing essential. He had found, in his years as a Jedi, that people given the truth, whole and without decoration made better decisions than people given curated fragments. Rob listened the way his father had apparently taught him, completely, without interrupting, his eyes doing the work of asking questions. When Qui-Gon finished, the young lord was quiet for a long moment. "You came north because something called you," Rob said finally. "Yes. The thing beyond the wall. I don't know its name. I know its quality. I have faced darkness before, men and entities who draw power from suffering, from fear, from the extinction of life. What I feel from beyond the wall is that, but older, much older, as if it predates the concept of opposition. Entirely." Qui-Gon held his hands toward the fire, watching the flames. "It doesn't hate life. It simply intends to end it. That's almost worse." Rob absorbed this without flinching. Whatever else the North produced, it produced people who did not require their catastrophes to be small enough to be comfortable. "John is at Castle Black," he said. "My brother. He's with the Night's Watch. He's been sending ravens, not official reports. Personal letters. He's seen things beyond the wall that the Lord Commander won't put in writing. I would like to speak with him. I'll send word ahead." Rob met his eyes. "I can give you an escort as far as the gift. After that, the Watch's jurisdiction starts and my authority ends." He paused. "I have to ask you something directly. Please. Can you stop it? Whatever is out there, can you stop it?" Qui-Gon looked at the young man across the fire. He thought of 100 things he could say, reassurances, qualifications, the diplomatic language of hope strategically deployed. He thought of what Yoda would say, and what Mace Windu would say, and what he himself had always believed about honesty being the only foundation on which real trust could be built. "I don't know," he said, "but I believe the Force brought me here for a reason. That is not the same as certainty. It is, however, something to work with." Rob Stark nodded slowly. "In the North, that's enough." Castle Black hit him like a wave. He felt it before he saw it, the wall itself, registering in the Force as something almost incomprehensible. 700 feet of ancient ice that was not merely frozen water but something constructed in a metaphysical sense, layered with intention so old it had become geology. Magic, they called it here. He recognized it the way you recognize a language you've never spoken but whose roots share something with your own. It was Force work. Ancient, crude by Jedi standards, but Force work nonetheless. Someone had poured tremendous power into this barrier long ago, sealing something on the other side, or trying to. Jon Snow met him at the gate with the same directness his brother had shown, wearing it differently, quieter, more watchful, with the particular alertness of someone who has recently survived something that should have killed him and hasn't yet decided what to do. With that information, they walked the wall's top together, wind cutting across the ice fields below with a sound like distant breathing. "You feel it," Jon said. It wasn't a question. "Since King's Landing," Qui-Gon replied. "It grows stronger the closer I get. The dead are moving." Jon said it the way men say things. They've given up expecting to be believed. Flat. Factual. Exhausted. Not in ones or twos. Armies. The White Walkers command them. We fought them at Hardhome. We lost. Dragonglass kills them. Valyrian steel kills them. Nothing else we've found works. He glanced sideways. "Does your sword work?" Qui-Gon's hand moved to his lightsaber. He ignited it. One smooth motion. The blue-white blade humming to life against the Arctic wind, casting pale light across the ice below. Jon Snow took a half-step back, not in fear, but in the involuntary physical response to something the body recognizes as significant before the mind catches up. "Plasma," Qui-Gon said, "superheated to temperatures beyond what forged steel can achieve." He studied the blade. "If dragonglass and Valyrian steel affect them because of their metaphysical properties rather than purely physical ones, this may do the same." He paused. "Or it may do nothing. I will not know until I face one." From beyond the wall, carried on the wind, came a sound. It was not quite a scream, not quite silence. something in the space between, in a register that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to the oldest part of the brain, the part that remembered genetically what it meant to be prey. The wall groaned. Jon Snow's hand found his sword hilt without conscious direction. Qui-Gon closed his eyes and reached into the Force, extending his perception outward across the ice fields, past the tree line, into the darkness gathering on the other side of the world's largest door. What he found there made him still in a way that had nothing to do with cold. There were no individual minds, no hatred, no ambition, no fear, none of the emotional signatures that defined living consciousness in the Force. There was instead a single enormous absence, a negative space shaped like intention, moving with the coherence of thought, but carrying none of its warmth. An army of extinguished lights moving in perfect coordination, guided by something at their center that was not absent at all. The Night King burned in the Force like a black star, cold, aware, and in this moment, across hundreds of miles of frozen darkness, aware of him. Qui-Gon opened his eyes. "We have very little time," he said quietly. The Night King knew he was there. Qui-Gon felt the acknowledgement. Travel back through the Force like a response to a question he hadn't meant to ask, a cold intelligence turning its attention southward with the slow certainty of something that had never needed to hurry, because it had never faced anything that could stop it. In 40 years as a Jedi, he had felt the presence of dark side users ranging from common Darksiders to Darth Maul's feral rage to the vast architectural malevolence of Palpatine's design. None of them had felt like this. The Sith drew from the dark side. They used it, channeled it, weaponized it. The Night King did not use the darkness. He was it, distilled, purified, ancient beyond the concept of opposition. Qui-Gon stepped back from the wall's edge and turned to Jon Snow. "How long before your reinforcements arrived from Stannis Baratheon's forces?" Jon's expression shifted, surprised that the stranger already knew the political topography. Then recalibration. "Weeks, maybe, if they come at all. Stannis wants the Iron Throne. The wall is a means to that end, not an end itself. And Dragonglass, how much do you have?" "Not enough. Never enough." Qui-Gon nodded slowly, processing. The Force was unusually quiet now. The way it went quiet before events of genuine consequence, not empty, but gathered, like breath held before the dive. He had learned long ago to respect that quality of silence. It meant the living Force had said everything it intended to say and was now simply waiting to see what he would do with it. What he did was walk down from the wall and find Melisandre. She found him first, technically. He was crossing the inner yard of Castle Black when he felt her. A presence unlike anything else he had encountered in Westeros. Burning with genuine power, genuine connection to something real and vast. In a world where most people registered in the Force as flickering candles, she was an open forge. It startled him enough that he stopped walking. She was already watching him from the doorway of her quarters. Red robes absolutely motionless in a wind that moved everything else. Her eyes were the color of fire reflected in dark water. "I saw you in the flames 3 months ago," she said. A man of light falling from a sky that had no stars. Qui-Gon studied her carefully. Her power was real. That much was unambiguous. Through the Force. Its source was more complex. Not the living Force as he understood it. Not the dark side as he knew it. But something adjacent to both. A channel open toward something enormous that called itself a god and may or may not have been lying about what it was. He had met entities that called themselves gods before. The category was less informative than it sounded. "You serve the Lord of Light," he said. "Lawler." "Yes." She moved toward him without quite seeming to decide to. "And you serve something else. Something older." She stopped 3 feet away and looked at him with an attention that was not entirely human in its quality. The Force. The word in her mouth was wrong. The syllables unfamiliar, as if she were pronouncing something she had read but never heard spoken. But the concept landed correctly, and that was more surprising than anything that had happened since King's Landing. "You know of it," he said. "The Red Priests have texts. Fragments from before the long night. The first one, not the one coming now. There were beings who walked between worlds in those days, who could move matter with thought and see the shape of time." Her eyes held as steadily. "We called them servants of the great others opposite. We were wrong about what they were, but we were not wrong that they were real. Qui-Gon was quiet for a moment. Around them, Castle Black moved with the controlled urgency of men preparing for something they couldn't fully articulate. Extra wood stacked against walls. Dragonglass arrowheads counted and recounted. The particular busyness of people who need their hands occupied, so their minds don't dwell on what's coming. You believe I am Azor Ahai, he said. The prophecy describes a warrior reborn in salt and smoke who wields a burning sword against the darkness. Her gaze dropped briefly to his lightsaber. You carry a blade of pure light. You fell from a sky of smoke and landed near the sea. She looked back up. The symbols align. Symbols align because people make them align. Qui-Gon replied, not unkindly. I have seen prophecy used as justification for tremendous harm. In my world, and I suspect in yours. I am not Azor Ahai. I am a man trained to serve the living Force. If that serves your Lord of Light's purposes, that is incidental. He paused. But I would like to understand what you know about the Night King's weakness. Not from prophecy, from observation. Something shifted. In Melisandre's expression, the priestess calculating whether to be offended and deciding the question was too useful to waste on pride. He was made, she said finally. The children of the forest made him, long before men had kingdoms. They drove a dragonglass dagger into a man's heart, and something answered their call, something they intended to use as a weapon against the first men. She paused. What answers a call from beyond the boundaries of the world does not always remain a weapon. They opened a door. Qui-Gon said quietly, and what came through was larger than the door. Yes, he understood then, with the clarity that the Force sometimes granted in moments of genuine stillness. What the Night King was. Not evil in the way the Sith were evil. Not a corruption of something that had been good. Not a living being who had chosen darkness for comprehensible reasons. He was a wound. A place where the barrier between the living Force and something on the other side of it had been torn open and never properly healed. The army of the dead was not his weapon. They were his symptom. The attack came 3 days later. Not at the wall. That was the first surprise. The dead came from the east, around the wall's edge where the sea met the ice. A column of whites moving through the shallows with the complete indifference of things that do not breathe and do not need to. Jon Snow had positioned dragonglass-armed rangers along the likely approach routes based on previous patterns. This was not a previous pattern. By the time the Ravens reached Castle Black, the first village south of the wall was already burning with cold blue flame. Qui-Gon rode out with Jon Snow and 40 rangers as the sky turned a particular shade of gray that was less a color than an absence of color. He rode in silence, feeling the Force ahead of them, the vast negative space of the dead moving with coordinated purpose, and at their center, growing closer by the minute, the black star of the Night King's awareness. The Night King was coming himself. That was not expected. He was coming because of Qui-Gon. He understood that too. In 40 years of sensing dark side presences, he had never been specifically sought by one in this way, not as a threat to be eliminated tactically, but as something to be assessed directly, the way an ancient predator investigates the only thing in its territory it doesn't recognize. They met on a snow field at the edge of a village whose name Qui-Gon had not learned. The whites stopped 40 feet away, a wall of extinguished faces in the gray morning light. Jon Snow's rangers held their line with the taut discipline of men whose fear had been compressed into something functional. Qui-Gon stepped forward alone. The Night King came through the center of his army on a dead horse and stopped. They regarded each other across the snow. Through the Force, Qui-Gon reached toward that vast cold consciousness and felt it reach back. Not in communication exactly, but in the mutual recognition of two fundamentally different kinds of awareness acknowledging each other's existence. The Night King tilted his head with the particular curiosity of something that had not encountered novelty in a very long time. Qui-Gon ignited his lightsaber. The blue-white blade cut the gray morning like a declaration. In the Force, he felt the dead army register it, not in fear. They couldn't feel fear, but in the way a shadow registers unexpected light, a disturbance moving through the collective absence of their consciousness, rippling outward from the blade. The Night King raised one hand. The dead surged forward. Qui-Gon moved. What followed was not elegant. Jedi combat at its finest was a dialogue. Blade and body working in conversation with the Force, reading the opponent, finding the spaces between actions. Fighting the dead was not a dialogue. It was mathematics. They did not tire, did not fear, did not hesitate, and their numbers were a kind of argument that skill alone couldn't answer. He moved through them like water finding the path of least resistance, his blade taking limbs, dispersing whites with force pushes that sent 3 and 4 at a time tumbling across the snow. His mind split between the immediate physical engagement and the larger spatial awareness of the battle around him. His blade touched a white's neck and the creature collapsed. Not from the heat alone. He felt it through the force, the plasma, interacting with whatever bound the dead to animation in the same way dragonglass did, disrupting the unnatural connection at its source. The lightsaber worked, but the Night King had not moved. He stood at the field's center watching with his head still tilted, evaluating. Then he raised both hands. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 4 seconds. Ice crystallized on Qui-Gon's robes, on his eyelashes, on the hilt of his lightsaber. Around the field, Jon Snow's rangers began moving slower, their breath coming in ragged clouds, the cold working at them with deliberate surgical intent. 3 men went down, not killed by whites, but simply stopped by cold that had become a weapon. Qui-Gon planted his feet and reached into the Force with everything he had. Not a battle, he understood suddenly, with the clarity that sometimes arrived exactly too late and exactly on time simultaneously. A message. The Night King was not trying to kill him. He was showing him what was coming. The cold receded as suddenly as it had arrived. One moment it was surgical and total, pressing the life from Jon Snow's rangers with the patience of something that measured time in centuries, rather than heartbeats. Then the Night King lowered his hands, and it simply stopped, not warming, but ceasing, the way a held note ceases when the musician decides the point has been made. The dead stood motionless in their ranks. The whites Qui-Gon had dispersed did not rise again. The blue flame in the village behind them guttered and went quiet. Jon Snow reached him first, moving through the snow with his sword still drawn, breath ragged, eyes reading the battlefield with the rapid assessment of someone, learning to command in real time. Why did they stop? They were never meant to win today, Qui-Gon said. His voice was steady, but he was breathing harder than he would have liked, the force still resonating in his hands from the sustained effort of the engagement. This was a demonstration. For you. For me. Jon looked at the place where the Night King had stood. Empty now, the dead retreating northward in silence, leaving only compressed snow and the particular stillness of aftermath. What did it demonstrate? Qui-Gon was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the dead disappear into the treeline. Through the force he could still feel the Night King's retreat, not fleeing. Nothing so urgent as that, simply withdrawing, with the unhurried confidence of something that had accomplished precisely what it intended. The cold intelligence had looked at him across a snow field and shown him, with complete clarity, the arithmetic of the long night. The dead numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They did not tire. They did not feel. And every man who fell to them became one of them. A calculation that only moved in one direction. That a single Jedi is not enough? Qui-Gon said finally. He said it without self-pity, which Jon Snow seemed to recognize. Because he didn't offer consolation. He simply nodded once. Slowly, the way men nod when truth arrives in an uncomfortable shape and they've decided to receive it anyway. Then what do we do? Qui-Gon turned back toward Castle Black, the wind at his back now, carrying from the north the faint resonance of that vast cold absence growing. Always growing, patient as geology. He thought about the question with everything he had, not just tactically, not just in terms of the Force and what it was telling him, but in the older, quieter way that his own Master had taught him to think before the Jedi Council had opinions about anything. What does the living Force actually need from you in this moment? Not victory. Not necessarily. The living Force was not concerned with outcomes in the way beings attached to outcomes were concerned with them. It was concerned with alignment, with whether the actions taken were true to the nature of things, whether they served life rather than the idea of life, whether they came from presence rather than fear. What the living Force needed from him, he understood as they walked, was not a battle won. It was a door closed, The Night King was made. Qui-Gon said as Castle Black's torches appeared. Through the gray distance ahead, the children of the forest drove, dragging glass into a living man's heart, and something from beyond the boundaries of this world answered that call and never left. He glanced at John. In my world, we have a concept, a wound in the Force, a place where the barrier between the living energy of existence and the void beyond it has been torn. It bleeds darkness into whatever surrounds it. It cannot be healed by fighting what comes through it. He paused. It can only be closed at the source. John walked in silence for a moment. You're saying we have to reach him, not just fight his army. His army is a symptom. He is the wound. Qui-Gon felt the truth of it settle through him as he said it, the particular quality of rightness that the Force sometimes granted to realizations. Not comfort exactly, but the solid ground of understanding beneath uncertain footing. The dragonglass dagger the children used to create him. If the wound was opened with something of this world, it may be closed with something of this world, combined with something that doesn't belong here at all. John stopped walking. Your blade. The plasma disrupts the binding that animates the dead. If it can do that to his army, Qui-Gon let the sentence complete itself in the space between them. It might do it to him. John's jaw tightened. We'd have to get close enough. Yes. Through hundreds of thousands of dead. Yes. Jon Snow looked at him for a long moment in the gray Westeros morning. And Qui-Gon looked back, and in the Force he felt the young man's fear clearly, not the fear of dying. Jon Snow had made some accommodation with that already, but the deeper fear of leading people he loved into something that might consume them all. It was the fear of command, which was really the fear of consequence, which was really the fear of being the reason. Qui-Gon had felt it himself, once. He had felt it before Naboo. Before every operation where he'd brought a Padawan into danger. He had never found a way to resolve it. He had only found a way to act despite it. You don't have to be certain, Qui-Gon said quietly. You only have to be present. They planned for 2 weeks. Melisandre contributed what the Red Priests. Fragments described about the original ritual, the location, a place north of the wall that the old texts called the Sea of Shadows, where the land itself was wrong in ways that even the dead seemed to avoid unless directed there. Bran Stark, reached by Raven from Winterfell, sent information that his strange sight had gathered green dreams of the first long night, images of the place where the first man had been transformed, a stone altar surrounded by carved spirals. That meant something in the language of the children of the forest that no living person could fully translate, but that resonated. When Qui-Gon read the description, in the Force like a struck bell, Robb Stark sent 300 men. He sent them without being asked. The Raven arriving at Castle Black reading only, whatever you need. The North remembers what matters. The march beyond the wall took 4 days. Qui-Gon spent those days in a particular quality of attention that he had learned from his own master and passed to Obi-Wan and tried to pass to Anakin and never quite managed the attention that is not vigilance, which is tensed against threat, but presence, which is open to everything including threat without being defined by it. He walked through landscapes of impossible beauty, ice formations that caught the weak northern light and scattered it into colors he didn't have names for. Ancient weirwood, trees whose red-leafed faces watched the column pass with expressions that were not quite human and not quite not. He felt the Force in everything here, wilder than anywhere in the galaxy, less shaped by civilization, still carrying the memory of the world's first morning in its stones and roots and frozen rivers. He thought about Obi-Wan, about Anakin, about the boy he'd found on Tatooine whose future had felt like a sun in the Force, brilliant, total, capable of warming an entire galaxy or burning it entirely, depending on what hands shaped him. He wondered, not for the first time since arriving in this world, whether the Force had brought him here partly because he needed to be somewhere he wasn't carrying the weight of that particular future, whether distance, true, dimensional distance, was the only way to fully release attachment to outcomes you'd invested everything in. The Force, as usual, declined to answer directly. The Sea of Shadows announced itself through the Force before it appeared. Visually, a pressure change, a quality of wrongness, in the air that wasn't cold exactly but was cold's philosophical ancestor. The stone altar stood at the center of a natural depression in the ice, carved spirals exactly as Bran's description had indicated, dragonglass fragments still embedded in its surface after thousands of years, preserved by cold that had never fully released them. The Night King was already there. Of course he was. He had known they were coming. He had let them come. He stood beside the altar, with his army arrayed in a vast, silent circle around the depression, hundreds of thousands of dead in absolute stillness. And he watched Qui-Gon descend toward him with the same tilted head, attention as the snow field, that ancient curiosity, that evaluation of the unprecedented. Jon Snow held the line at the depression's rim with the living, their dragonglass weapons in hand, their faces set. Melisandre stood among them, her lips moving in prayers to a god who may or may not have been listening. Qui-Gon walked to the altar alone. He ignited his lightsaber. He reached into the Force with everything, not a weapon, not a shield, but an act of pure presence, of radical openness to the living energy of this world, of every heart beating in the circle, above him and every root drinking, frozen water beneath his feet, and every ember of consciousness that the long night had not yet extinguished. He gathered it the way water gathers in a low place, not by force, but by being the place where it naturally flows. The Night King raised one hand. Qui-Gon was already moving, not toward the Night King, toward the altar. He drove his lightsaber into the dragonglass at its center, through it, into the stone beneath, into the wound itself, pouring every gathered thread of living Force energy through the blade, and into the place where the tear between worlds had been held open for 8,000 years. The plasma and the dragonglass and the Force worked together in a reaction that had no name in any language, spoken in any galaxy, a closing rather than an explosion, a healing rather than a destruction, the wound knitting shut from the inside with a sound that was felt rather than heard, a deep, subsonic tone that moved through the ice, and the stone and the bones of everyone present. The Night King stopped moving. He stood perfectly still, and in the Force Qui-Gon felt the vast cold intelligence flicker, not diminish, not rage, but pause. The way a fire pauses when the fuel it requires is suddenly no longer present. The connection sustaining him, the open wound that had fed his existence for millennia, was closing. He turned his ancient eyes on Qui-Gon with an expression that had no human name but was perhaps the closest thing to surprise that 8,000 years of absolute certainty could produce. Then the dead began to fall, not all at once, in waves, rippling outward from the altar, first the nearest, dropping like marionettes whose strings had been simultaneously released, then further and further, until the vast silent circle was simply gone. 100,000 bodies on the ice, still, the cold blue light extinguishing in each of them, like candles snuffed by the same breath. The Night King was the last. He stood alone in the center of his fallen army and looked at Qui-Gon across the altar, and in the Force there was one final moment of contact. That cold awareness acknowledging something it could not have anticipated, an element introduced from outside the equations. It had calculated across 8,000 years. Not defeat exactly. Completion. The wound closed. The long work finally, impossibly, finished. He lowered his hand and was gone. Not destroyed. Gone. Released. Perhaps from the thing the children of the forest had trapped in a living man's body so long ago that the man was less than a memory. What remained when the Night King ceased was only the silence, and the ice, and the pale northern sky beginning, almost imperceptibly, to lighten. Qui-Gon stood at the altar with his hand still on his lightsaber hilt, breathing. Above him, Jon Snow said nothing for a long moment. Then, is it done? Qui-Gon reached into the Force and listened. From the north, nothing. Not the cold absence of the dead. Not the vast negative pressure of the Night King's awareness. Simply the living quiet of a world that had exhaled something it had been holding for 8,000 years. Ice and root and frozen river and the small, flickering presences of animals beginning, cautiously, to move in the silence. In the weeks that followed, the news traveled south faster than any raven, carried by men who had been there, who had watched the dead fall, who had no framework for what they'd witnessed, but knew irrefutably that the long night would not come. The wall still stood. The north breathed again. Qui-Gon did not return to King's Landing. He had no interest in what Cersei would make of the story, nor in how Tywin Lannister would attempt to weaponize it. He stayed in the north, in the quiet, walking the ancient forests, where the weirwood faces watched him with their carved red eyes, and the Force moved through everything, unhurried and wild and entirely itself. He did not know if the Force would eventually return him to his own galaxy. He suspected it would, when it was ready, when whatever thread had drawn him here had fully played out. Until then, he was content to be present, to sit with Jon Snow by fires and answer questions about a galaxy far away, to walk with the old blind maester whose books on the long nights first coming contained fragments of Force knowledge, so ancient they had been mistranslated into myth. He had closed a wound that was 8,000 years old. He had done it without an army, without a council's permission, without certainty of outcome or guarantee of return. He had simply followed the Force. In the end, that was always enough. In the silence of the northern forest, a Jedi Master who had crossed the impossible distance between worlds sat, beneath a weirwood tree, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the living Force was simply, quietly, at peace. May the Force be with you.